My name is Arlo Mitchell, and I turned 81 this past spring. I live alone now in a small, single-story brick house on the outskirts of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It's a modest place, with faded green shutters and a leaning mailbox that I never quite got around to fixing. The lawn isn't what it used to be. I struggle with the mower now. But the daffodils my wife planted along the front porch still come up every spring as if she never left. I used to think they were a miracle. Now they just remind me of everything that's gone quiet. My days follow a routine so predictable it feels like clockwork. I wake at 6:15 not because I want to, but because my body no longer lets me sleep through the dawn. My joints, hips, knees, and that old shoulder I dislocated coaching high school baseball protest every movement, and I shuffle to the kitchen in my slippers, with the cautiousness of someone who knows how expensive a fall can be. I make oatmeal. I sit with the newspaper. I feed the pigeons that gather near the porch. I read. Sometimes I write. Memoirs mostly. Scribbled down in spiral notebooks I've had since my teaching days. My handwriting is worse now. Arthritis in my fingers makes the letters waver. I tell myself it gives the pages character, like the journals of old war veterans or explorers lost at sea. Before retirement, I taught American history for over 40 years, high school level. I wasn't a great teacher, not in the theatrical, beloved by all sense. I didn't throw chalk or call students comrades or wear Civil War costumes like some of my peers who made the local paper, but I was respected. I was dependable. My students learned. Parents liked that I never raised my voice but still commanded order. I never missed a semester. My colleagues used to joke that I was part of the architecture, that the school would crumble if I ever left. It didn't. It went on fine without me. After I retired, I thought I would travel with my wife, Marlene. We'd saved for it. There was a folder in my filing cabinet marked Spain, filled with clippings, itineraries, printouts, from websites I barely knew how to use. But 3 months after I turned in my final gradebook, Marlene had a stroke in the grocery store parking lot. A woman found her slumped over the steering wheel of our Honda. They said she died instantly. I suppose it's a mercy, though it didn't feel like one at the time. Marlene was the kind of woman who filled up the silence. She was always humming, always stirring something on the stove, always on the phone with someone. Her sister in Racine, her friends from church. She called me Mr. Mitchell when she was amused with me, which was often. After she died, the house changed. It went from warm to neutral, from filled with the smell of cinnamon and Sunday roast to vaguely dust and antiseptic. I stopped cooking, started heating up frozen meals. Some nights I forget to eat altogether, not because I don't want to, but because it no longer feels like a part of life. Just a maintenance routine, like watering a lawn you don't walk on. I have one son, Garrett, 49 years old. Used to work in corporate logistics, now does something with operations management. I never quite understood what. He lives about an hour away on the other side of the city, in a larger house, with a larger mortgage, and a wife named Jody, who always wears expensive cardigans and calls me Dad like it's a burden. They have 2 teenagers, Ethan and Maxine. I haven't seen either of them in over a year, maybe longer. They're busy. That's what Garrett says when I ask. Busy with school, activities, college prep. Kids these days, he says, like it's some kind of universal explanation. I used to drive over sometimes, bring homemade muffins or old photo albums, try to find a way in. But Jody always looked like she was holding her breath when I arrived. Garrett would smile, distracted. And the kids? They stayed in their rooms. I stopped going, stopped calling as often. I told myself I didn't want to be a nuisance, but deep down, I knew I already was. Still, I thought, when the time comes, when I really need them, they'll be there. You tell yourself these things when you're a father, It's not even denial. It's faith, hardwired somewhere under your ribs. I still have my mind, mostly. I read a lot, solve crosswords, remember dates. I sometimes forget where I left my glasses, but never the birthdays of my students or the name of my 6th grade history teacher. I am not demented. I am not feeble. I just don't move as fast as I used to. I just don't argue anymore, because there's no one left to argue with. I don't talk much to neighbors. The ones I used to chat with have either moved away or passed on. The new ones are young, always rushing somewhere, earbuds in, waving politely from behind sunglasses. There's a boy across the street who skateboarded past my house all summer long last year. One day he fell hard and split his chin. I helped him up, gave him paper towels, called his mom. He didn't say thank you, just left a bloodied napkin on my porch. That's how things are now. Gratitude feels old-fashioned, like handwritten letters or house calls. A few weeks ago, Garrett called me for the first time in months. I remember because it was the day I was reorganizing my old lesson plans, thinking about donating them to the local school board. I almost didn't pick up. My instinct told me it was a robocall. But I answered. His voice was too cheerful. "Hey, Dad, how are you holding up?" I told him I was fine, that nothing had changed, that the birds still came and the heater still rattled. He chuckled awkwardly and said, "Listen, Jody and I have been thinking." And just like that, the tone shifted. He said they were worried about me living alone, that I'd had a good run of independence, but it was time to think realistically. He said they'd found a solution. "What kind of solution?" I asked. And there was a pause, the kind of pause that tells you what you don't want to hear. "We think it'd be best if you came to stay with us for a while. You know, just until we figure out something more permanent." I sat there holding the phone, staring at the picture of Marlene on the wall, the one where she's in the garden, squinting at the sun and laughing at something I said. I wanted to ask Garrett why now, why the sudden interest, why the push, but I didn't. I said, "Let me think about it." He said, Of course. But I could hear the expectation in his voice. That night, I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind pushing branches against the window pane. I thought about the word solution. I thought about what it means to become someone else's logistical problem. I thought I still had time. I didn't know then that this call was just the beginning, that everything familiar was about to slip out from under me like a rug yanked too fast. But part of me, I think, had been waiting for it all along. 2 weeks after that phone call, Garrett arrived unannounced on a Saturday morning. I heard the rumble of his SUV in the driveway and looked out the window in time to see him stepping out, followed by Jody. Both of them were dressed like they had somewhere more important to be. He in a fleece vest over a pressed button-down, she in tight slacks and oversized sunglasses, as though the Midwest sun was something dangerous. I hadn't been expecting anyone, and the sudden appearance of their silhouettes against my porch made me feel like I'd woken up in the wrong house. I opened the door before they could knock. Garrett hugged me, quickly, perfunctorily, and Jody waved, offering me a tight smile. They didn't wait for an invitation. Garrett brushed past me, commenting on the draft from the front door, and Jody made a beeline for the kitchen like she'd been there yesterday instead of a year ago. I stood there, still in my robe, wondering if I should feel angry, grateful, or just confused. Garrett clapped his hands and said, "Dad, we need to talk. Sit down." "This won't take long." I sat at the kitchen table, the same one Marlene and I had eaten breakfast at for over 30 years, now suddenly commandeered by people who rarely remembered my birthday. Garrett remained standing, pacing slightly, rubbing his hands together like a salesman warming up to his pitch. Jody leaned against the counter, arms crossed, her face pinched like she was bracing for a smell. We've been talking a lot lately, Garrett began, his voice adopting that particular tone people use when they're about to sell you something you don't want. And, look, this isn't easy for us to say, but it's time. You shouldn't be living here alone anymore. I blinked at him, waiting for the rest. He looked around the kitchen, pausing at the peeling laminate on the countertop, the dust on the top of the microwave, the grease smudge near the stove. He didn't say anything about them, but his silence was heavy with judgment. Jody jumped in, her voice sharp but coated in syrup. Garrett's just worried about you, Arlo. We both are. There are stairs here, and the bathtub has no grab bars. And this neighborhood isn't exactly safe anymore. Remember that break-in 2 blocks down last month? We read about it. I said nothing. Garrett took my silence as an invitation to continue. We thought it would be best if you came and stayed with us. Just for a while. We have the guest room. It's already furnished. You'd have your own bathroom, your own TV. We even cleared out a little corner of the garage so you could keep some of your things. I stared at the chipped rim of my coffee mug, letting their words settle in. Not because I didn't understand, but because I understood too well. There was no conversation here, just a presentation, a decision already made. You want me to leave my house? I said slowly, not as a question, but a confirmation. Garrett winced, as if I'd phrased it too harshly. It's not like that, he said. This place is falling apart. You've been here alone since Mom died, and it's not getting any easier for you. It's a matter of time before something happens. We just want to be proactive. Jody nodded. Besides, wouldn't it be nice to be around family again? The grandkids miss you? I looked up at her and said, What are their names again? She blinked, caught off guard. Garrett cleared his throat. Dad, come on, don't be like this. They had it all planned out. They'd brought a list of things I'd need to pack, essentials only, no need to haul everything. Garrett would take care of arranging the property manager, someone he knew from work who could handle the house while I was getting settled. There was no talk of what I wanted, only logistics, schedules, transitions. I asked, what about my books? The garden? My writing? Garrett shrugged. We can box up the books, maybe keep a few at the house. Jody doesn't really want clutter in the guest room. She didn't deny it. As the conversation wore on, I felt something shift inside me. Not panic, not quite rage, more like a bitter recognition. The same feeling I'd had when the school where I taught finally replaced the chalkboards with smart screens and didn't invite me to the ceremony. This was not an offer of help. It was a repurposing, a relocation. They were moving me like old furniture, convenient, unobtrusive, forgotten in the corner. Still, part of me was tired, lonely. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad, I thought. Maybe living with them would mean hearing laughter in the evenings again. Maybe I'd see my grandchildren more. Maybe it would be enough to be near people, even if the warmth wasn't entirely real. Loneliness does that to you. It makes you compromise with ghosts, so I nodded. All right, I said, but on one condition. Garrett perked up. Anything. I want to handle the documents myself. If I'm letting someone else live in this house, I want to know who. I want copies. No surprises. He hesitated for a beat too long, then smiled. Of course. We'll do everything above board. That afternoon, they helped me pack a single suitcase. Jody kept sighing at the state of my closet. Why do you have so many jackets? She asked. They're all the same. I didn't answer. Each jacket had a story. She didn't want stories. She wanted space. I left the house that evening with a sense of suspension, like I was being lifted off my own floorboards. Garrett promised we'd come back to settle things later, to clear out, to arrange storage. But I knew, even as I climbed into their car, that we wouldn't. I had already been moved. As we pulled away, I looked out the window at my porch, the empty swing swaying in the breeze. I remembered the sound of Marlene's laughter drifting through the screen door. I remembered the way she'd rest her head on my shoulder when we sat out there in the dusk. I remembered who I had been in that house. And I knew with a quiet certainty that I was leaving more than a building behind. I was leaving a self that no longer had a place in their world. The first few days in their house passed in an odd sort of quiet, the kind that felt more like a waiting room than a home. Garrett and Jody lived in a spacious, ultra-modern two-story house in a newly developed neighborhood, full of manicured lawns, faceless garages, and neighbors who smiled too widely when they jogged by with their matching dogs. Everything inside was pale. The walls, the carpet, the cabinetry. The decor had no warmth, no history. It was a house curated for appearance, not comfort. There were no family photos on the mantel, no clutter on the countertops, no fridge magnets. Every drawer had soft, close hinges. Every room smelled faintly of citrus cleaning agents. It wasn't a home, it was a showroom. They had cleared out the guest room for me, which was technically the basement. They called it the garden level, but the only window was narrow and half covered by a plastic grate. The ceiling was low, the mattress firm and untouched. The walls were beige, adorned with mass-produced paintings of coastal landscapes I'd never seen. My books were packed in a single box, left unopened in the corner. Garrett had placed a television on the dresser and beamed with pride as he showed me how to navigate the remote. I nodded politely, but never turned it on. The first week, they were courteous. Garrett offered to drive me to the library, which turned out to be a suggestion that I try e-books instead. Jody asked what kind of tea I liked, only to stock the pantry with green detox sachets and chamomile, nothing close to the black Darjeeling I preferred. Meals were served at rigid times, plated carefully, portioned meticulously. No salt, no butter, no red meat. When I asked for something simple, like bacon and eggs, Jody raised her eyebrows and laughed gently. "Dad, that stuff will kill you." Garrett said nothing, just pushed my plate closer to me. It didn't take long before the small slights began piling up. At first, it was the patronizing tone. Garrett speaking slowly and loudly, as if I had gone deaf overnight. Then it was the conversations I wasn't part of, murmured upstairs just loud enough to be audible but not decipherable. They'd slip out in the evening and return late, whispering, occasionally laughing, stopping when I entered the room. The dinner table became a cold terrain of careful nods and silent chewing. I began to feel like a ghost, present, tolerated, but not really seen. They started managing my medications. Without asking, Jody took over organizing my pills into little plastic boxes labeled by day, placing them on a tray in the kitchen. "Just to keep things simple," she said. One morning, I noticed that one of my blood pressure pills was missing. When I asked, she looked confused. "You don't need that one anymore. We're streamlining things. Your doctor said so." I hadn't seen my doctor in 3 months. My outings were discouraged. Garrett would make excuses when I asked to go for a walk or to the market. "Let us know first," he'd say. "We just don't want you getting lost. You've been a little forgetful lately." I hadn't been. I remembered everything, too much even. The way Jody would sigh when I entered the room, how Garrett avoided eye contact when we spoke, the glances they exchanged behind my back. It wasn't concern. It was strategy. The most humiliating moment came one morning when I tried to make my own breakfast. I'd woken up early, the way I always did, and quietly made my way upstairs to the kitchen. I pulled out the frying pan, cracked 2 eggs, and had just reached for the salt when Jody stormed in her bathrobe, face pale with fury. "Dad, what are you doing?" I stammered something about just wanting to make myself something warm. She grabbed the pan and turned off the stove. You could have set off the smoke alarm. What if you forgot and walked away? You can't be doing this. Garrett appeared a minute later, hair uncombed, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Everything all right? He asked. Jody turned to him, gesturing to the stove like I'd set fire to the drapes. He was cooking, she said, her voice tight. Garrett looked at me like a disappointed supervisor. Dad. We talked about this. Let us handle the cooking, okay? We're just trying to keep you safe. I stood there holding the spatula, heart thudding in my ears, eggs ruined. My mouth opened, but no sound came. They were treating me like a liability, a child, someone to be managed, not a man who had raised a son, paid off a mortgage, buried a wife. That morning, I didn't eat. I went back downstairs and sat in the dark for hours. Then came the clinic visit. Jody scheduled it without asking. Just a routine checkup, she said. It'll help us stay on top of things. Garrett drove me to a clinic I'd never been to before, a private facility on the other side of the city. The nurse smiled too much, asked me strange questions. Do you ever feel confused? Do you forget where you are? Have you ever found yourself unable to recognize people? I answered no to all of them, but I could tell they weren't really listening. The doctor examined me briefly, asked Garrett to join us halfway through. They spoke over me, referencing charts I hadn't seen, using words like early signs and age-related decline. I sat there, coat folded in my lap, invisible, in the center of the room. Back in the car, I asked Garrett what the point of all that was. He shrugged. Just making sure we cover our bases. You've seemed off lately. It's not a big deal. We just need to be realistic. I didn't respond. I was starting to understand. This wasn't about concern. It was about laying the groundwork. That evening, I overheard them speaking in the kitchen. My room was just below, and the heating vents carried sound like confessionals. Jody. We have to move on this. He's not going to last much longer down there. You saw what happened this morning. Garrett. We can't force it. He still has legal standing. We need paperwork. Jody. Then get it, or we'll never get that house on the market. I froze. They weren't helping me. They weren't protecting me. They were building a case against me for something. Control, I assumed. Maybe power of attorney. Maybe guardianship. Maybe worse. The worst part? I had given them the opening. I had let them carry my life away in plastic totes and polite smiles. And now, somewhere in their plans, I had become an obstacle to remove, not a man to be cared for. Something had shifted irrevocably, and the floor beneath my feet, however cracked and dusty, was no longer mine to stand on. One late evening, as the house settled into its habitual silence and the soft hum of the city faded beyond the windows, I found myself restless, unable to ignore the gnawing unease growing inside me. I had retreated to the basement bedroom that felt more like a cell, the small window casting dim light over the walls plastered with generic art, and the boxes of belongings I hadn't unpacked. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the dull carpet, my mind racing through memories and fragments of conversations I'd overheard. Something was wrong, far more than the thin veneer of kindness Garrett and Jody had maintained. I knew it. I'd suspected it for weeks, but now the suspicion was turning into dread. Earlier that day, when Garrett had left the house to attend a late meeting, I noticed that he had carelessly left his laptop open on the kitchen counter. The screen was awake, showing an email draft titled Power of Attorney and Guardianship Papers. Curiosity, or maybe desperation, urged me to glance over his shoulder. The words on the screen chilled me. We need to begin the process to have Arlo declared legally incapacitated. His recent incidents with cooking and medication administration highlight his inability to manage his affairs. The rest was a legal jargon haze, but the intent was clear. They were plotting to strip me of my rights, to control me like a possession. My hands trembled as I closed the laptop and retreated back to my room. I sat in the darkness, absorbing the reality that my son was moving to erase me, not just from his home, but from my own life. The feeling was like being slowly buried alive, suffocated under layers of false concern and quiet betrayal. I thought about the house I had lived in for decades, the memories infused in every creak of the floorboards, every scent of worn leather and aged paper, and I realized they were trying to cut me off from it all. That night, sleep was a stranger. I lay awake listening to the faint footsteps upstairs, the muted voices muffled behind closed doors. My mind replayed the fragments of conversations, the doctor's patronizing gaze, the way Garrett had avoided my questions, and Jody's cold smiles. The fear of losing my autonomy settled deep into my bones. I understood then that the fight for my dignity was no longer optional. It was a necessity. The following morning, I found a moment alone and decided to act. I retrieved an old address book from my suitcase, a relic from years past, and found the number of an old friend and trusted confidant, Walter, who had been a colleague from my teaching days, and later a notary. I hesitated only briefly before calling him, my voice steady despite the turmoil within. Walter answered after a few rings, his familiar, warm tone a balm to my frayed nerves. I explained as carefully as I could what was happening, how my son and daughter-in-law were maneuvering to take control over my affairs, how they had dismissed my concerns and isolated me. Walter listened quietly, then reassured me that there were ways to reclaim my legal standing and protect myself from unwanted guardianship. He promised to come over the next day to help me review my documents and advise me on the steps I could take. His arrival brought a measure of calm. Over the course of the afternoon, we went through old legal papers, wills, property deeds, power of attorney forms I had signed years ago without fully understanding their implications. Walter pointed out clauses and suggested revoking outdated powers that Garrett might exploit. We discussed updating my will and securing my rights to my property. For the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of hope, a sense that I might still hold the strongest weapon I possessed, the truth and the law. Meanwhile, I began quietly reclaiming my scattered belongings. I moved boxes into the basement room, organized my papers, and dusted off the few books I still owned. I wrote a letter to my bank, requesting copies of recent transactions, and I started keeping a journal, documenting every interaction, every word that felt like a slight or an attempt to control. I realized that documentation would be my shield and sword in the battle ahead. But the fight was not just legal. It was deeply personal and emotional. When Garrett returned that evening, I confronted him gently but firmly. "I know what you and Jody are planning," I said, meeting his eyes for the first time in weeks without looking away. "I am not incapacitated, and I will not give you the right to make decisions for me without my consent." His face darkened, the polite veneer slipping for a moment to reveal frustration and anger. "Dad, this isn't about control. It's about your safety. You need help. You don't see it, but we do." I shook my head. "What you call help feels like a prison. I am not the man you think I am. I still have my mind, and I still have my will." That night I lay awake again, the weight of their plans heavy on my chest, but now tempered by the knowledge that I was not powerless. Walter's words echoed in my mind. "You have the right to fight. You have the strongest weapon, your voice and your truth." For the first time, I began to believe that this battle, though daunting, could be won. The days that followed were a whirlwind of quiet determination. I met with Walter again to prepare legal documents, began consulting an independent doctor to attest to my mental competence, and reached out to a local elder advocacy group. Each small step was a reclaiming of myself, a refusal to be erased. But it also marked the beginning of open conflict with my own son, a conflict I knew would change everything. I understood now that this midpoint was not just a turning moment in my struggle, but a crossroads in my life. I could retreat into silence and surrender the rest of my days to being managed and controlled, or I could stand up, wield my strongest weapon, my dignity, my truth, and the law, and fight to be seen, heard, and respected once more. I chose to fight. After confronting Garrett that evening, something between us shifted. No longer veiled hostility, no more illusions of familial respect. Whatever fragile civility we had clung to shattered, and in its place grew a mutual awareness. I had seen through him, and he no longer needed to pretend. The days that followed were heavy with that unspoken wariness. Each interaction lacquered with barely disguised contempt. Jody, always the more transparent of the two, ceased pretending entirely. She stopped addressing me directly, no longer offering her clipped pleasantries or forced smiles. When I entered the room, she would leave it. When I asked a question, she would redirect it to Garrett or pretend not to hear. My meals became isolated experiences, usually prepared in advance and left in the fridge like offerings for a ghost. They didn't say I wasn't welcome at the dinner table. They just stopped calling me when it was set. I would hear them upstairs, plates clinking, laughter, the casual intimacy of a family I no longer belonged to, and I'd sit downstairs alone, chewing cold pasta with the television off, refusing to be baited into begging for inclusion. But passive cruelty was only the beginning. One morning I discovered that my checkbook and identification documents, which I'd carefully stored in the desk drawer beside my bed, were missing. At first I thought I had simply misplaced them, and I searched the entire room in a slow, methodical panic. I checked my suitcase, behind books, under the mattress, even the closet's top shelf. Nothing. When I asked Garrett about it, he barely looked up from his phone. "I moved them," he said, "for safekeeping. You left them out in the open. Anyone could have taken them." I tried to keep my voice calm. "I want them back." He shrugged, still scrolling. "Not now. We'll talk about it later. Maybe after your next evaluation." That word, evaluation, hit me like a slap. I was not an employee. I was not under review. I was a man whose dignity was being chipped away piece by calculated piece. Jody began implementing restrictions under the guise of routine. She set alarms on my phone to remind me when to take medications she had pre-sorted and replaced without consultation. She removed the coffee maker from the kitchen, claiming caffeine was bad for my heart. She installed child locks on the bathroom cabinet, where I kept my grooming supplies. She even began knocking before entering my space in the basement, not out of respect, but to announce her control. "We just want to prevent accidents," she said once, after replacing my razor with an electric shaver I didn't ask for. "You're at a fragile age, Arlo." Then came the meetings. Garrett began scheduling them like board reviews. Every few days he would come downstairs and tell me he needed to check in, using language that stripped our relationship of any remaining intimacy. He would sit across from me with a notebook, ask questions like a caseworker. How was I feeling? Had I been confused lately? Had I ever thought about harming myself? The first time he asked that, I laughed bitterly. "Are you serious?" I said. He didn't flinch. "It's standard," he said, jotting something down. I realized that he was building a file, documenting manufactured symptoms, carefully stacking the evidence of my decline. but it wasn't enough for them to suffocate me slowly. They needed the cooperation of the system. And so one morning they drove me, without warning, to a different clinic. Garrett told me in the car that it was just a follow-up. The building was bland, gray-bricked, and quiet. Inside, we were greeted by a woman in a blazer who led us into a beige room with no windows. There was a long table, a clipboard, a water cooler in the corner. It felt like an intake room at a psychiatric hospital. The woman began asking me a series of questions, memory tests, basic arithmetic, names of current politicians. I passed each one deliberately, making sure my answers were clear, enunciated, and timely. I could feel Garrett shift uncomfortably in his chair. When the woman asked him to describe my daily challenges, he launched into a rehearsed monologue about forgetfulness, instability, mood swings, and an incident with the stove. I looked her in the eye and said calmly, "None of that happened." "He is lying." She smiled politely and made a note. I realized she wasn't there to determine the truth. She was there to record a version of it, one filtered through the authority of the adult child who claimed to be concerned. Garrett's voice, not mine, filled the room. I left the building fuming, my hands shaking, not from age, but from a rage so potent I had to clutch the door handle to steady myself. Back at the house, Garrett said nothing. He didn't have to. He believed the trap was tightening, but what he hadn't anticipated was that I was already dismantling it from within. Walter had been busy on my behalf. He had already filed paperwork revoking the outdated power of attorney, drafted a statement affirming my mental and legal capacity, and scheduled an independent examination with a geriatric specialist unaffiliated with Garrett's clinic. I'd begun redirecting my mail to Walter's office. I had made a list of accounts, passwords, and statements that needed protection, and most importantly, I'd located a hidden copy of the deed to my home. That house, which Garrett had already begun referring to in the past tense, when we put it on the market, was not solely his to dispose of. I had retained joint ownership, and with Walter's help, I planned to formally reclaim it. The final crack came when I overheard a phone call late one night. Garrett had left his door ajar, and his voice carried down the hall. "Yes, we've already got the doctor's notes. No, he doesn't suspect anything. Once we get the court order, we'll transfer the house. We'll take care of him. Yeah, that's the plan. Assisted living or something. Somewhere out of the way." I froze, standing barefoot in the hall, staring into the dark. He wasn't just trying to declare me incompetent. He was planning to dispose of me entirely. Remove me from the house, stash me somewhere silent, and liquidate what he saw as his inheritance. The next morning, I disappeared. Not permanently, not loudly. I simply left before dawn. A small bag packed with essentials. The most critical documents hidden in a book I'd hollowed out. My phone wiped clean. I walked 2 miles to the train station and took the first local line to the city. Walter picked me up in his old Ford, and we drove in silence back to his office. I spent the night on the pull-out couch in his study, and the next morning we began executing the plan. We contacted the real estate attorney. We locked my accounts. We had the medical records reviewed by an independent team who signed off on a formal declaration of mental clarity. We filed the necessary court documents to prevent any guardianship motions. I filed a police report for unauthorized control of personal property and requested a hearing to demand the return of my ID and financial documents. Walter's office became the war room, and from that modest downtown suite with its creaky floorboards and leather chairs that smelled of pipe tobacco, I began the quiet war of reclaiming myself. Garrett called, of course. First calm, then anxious, then furious. I didn't answer. Jody sent emails, texted, "Where are you? This is irrational. You're scaring us. Please come back. We're contacting the authorities." I let the silence build. I wanted them to feel it. The silence of someone who'd stopped being afraid. When they realized I had slipped through their fingers, the mask dropped. The next message from Garrett wasn't concern. It was a threat. If you go through with this, we're done. Don't expect anything from me or the kids ever again. I read it once, then deleted it. It was the clearest thing he'd said in years. In the weeks that followed, I found a small apartment on the other side of town. A quiet building with older tenants, a modest view of a maple tree, and a landlord who didn't ask questions. I moved in with nothing but my essentials. No heirlooms, no furniture from the old house. I was starting over. Not because I wanted to, but because survival demanded it. By the time Garrett filed the guardianship motion, I had already counterfiled. His request was rejected by the court in the preliminary review. My own affidavit, bolstered by physician letters, financial independence documentation, and Walter's legal submissions, stood unshaken. The judge ruled that no further evaluations were necessary. I remained fully in control of my life, and all previous powers Garrett might have wielded were officially rescinded. I had won a battle, not just of legal status, but of personal autonomy. But it wasn't a victory I celebrated. It was one I sat with quietly in the evening, sipping lukewarm tea, watching the sun fold itself over the horizon through my small window. The cost had been high: trust, family, the illusion that blood binds tighter than ambition. Still, the silence that followed was no longer fearful. It was full of something else. Resolve. I was alone, yes. But I was not broken, and I was not theirs. I hadn't heard Garrett's voice in weeks when the message came. A voicemail left at my new number, which only a handful of people knew, likely leaked through a paperwork trail I hadn't yet cleaned up. I listened to it twice, sitting in the armchair by the window of my small apartment, watching the gray sky smear itself across the glass. His voice was low and controlled, but not calm. There was an undercurrent of panic that he could no longer suppress. "Dad," he said, as if the words still carried meaning, "we need to talk. I know you've made up your mind, but this has gone too far. You're being unreasonable. We can still fix this." There was a pause, then a colder, clipped tone. "But if you keep pushing, if you go through with everything, you're not just ruining our relationship. You're burning down your legacy. Think about that." He hung up. That word, legacy, sat in my chest like a stone. Legacy was what I had believed in, what I had built my whole life for. The house, the savings, the photo albums now boxed in storage. Everything I had constructed was meant to outlive me through my family. But now I saw it differently. Legacy was not what you left behind. It was what they remembered about you when you finally said no, when you stopped feeding the hand that grabbed for more, when you stopped smiling while they chiseled away your name from the front door. The court date for the formal revocation hearing had arrived. Garrett and Jody were expected to attend, not as family, but as parties with potential interest in an estate they could no longer claim control over. I did not want to see them. I had told Walter I would not testify unless required, and the judge agreed to handle it based on the evidence. Still, something compelled me that morning to go to the courthouse, not to plead, not to perform, but to look them in the eye one last time. The courthouse was cold and tall, a building designed to dwarf the people inside it. I sat near the back of the room, hat in hand, my coat too warm for the season but comforting nonetheless. Garrett and Jody arrived late, breathless, dressed in matching shades of gray and blue, their expressions drawn tight. When Garrett saw me, his jaw clenched. Jody looked away. They had come prepared for war, but found instead a mirror. The room was sparsely filled. 2 lawyers, 1 clerk, the judge, the echo of futures unraveling across beige carpet and wood veneer. The proceedings were swift. Walter's documents were impeccable. The judge read aloud findings from the independent medical board confirming my cognitive health, my financial independence, my retained legal capacity. When Garrett's lawyer attempted to submit an older statement claiming patterned memory loss, the judge interrupted. That report is superseded by verified court-appointed specialists. The motion for guardianship is formally dismissed. Garrett sat motionless, his arms crossed. Jody leaned forward, whispered something in his ear. He didn't react. Then came the final pronouncement, the clause I had fought hardest for. My co-ownership of the house was affirmed. The court recognized my right to liquidate my share or initiate a forced sale if no resolution could be reached with the other parties. It was a sentence delivered in measured legal cadence, but to me it landed like a verdict of truth. They could no longer pretend. I had a voice again. When it was over, I stood and began to leave quietly, hoping to escape before confrontation. But Garrett caught up to me in the corridor, his face flushed with a strange mix of shame and fury. "So that's it?" he said. "You'd rather humiliate us in court than work this out privately?" I turned slowly. "I tried to work it out with you. For years. You only started listening when I disappeared." Jody stepped forward, arms folded. "You made us look like monsters." I looked at her and said plainly, "You didn't need my help for that." She inhaled sharply as if to retort, but said nothing. Garrett moved closer, lowering his voice. "You're going to sell the house, aren't you?" I nodded. "It was never your house alone. You made that mistake when you stopped inviting me into it." He laughed bitterly. "You'll die alone, you know that? No one will be there. Not us. Not the grandkids. Not anyone." I looked him in the eyes and, for the first time, saw not my son, but a man I didn't recognize. A stranger who had once shared my name and nothing else. "You already left, Garrett. You just forgot to pack your absence." I walked out into the late morning sun, blinking against the brightness. My hands trembled slightly from adrenaline, but inside me a stillness began to settle. Not peace exactly, something closer to clarity. That courtroom had not given me back my dignity. I had reclaimed it long before, in the quiet hours of isolation, in the still resolve of a man they had called too weak to fight back. But they were wrong. I had not used fists, or rage, or threats. I had used the only weapon they underestimated: memory. Not the one that forgets, but the one that remembers everything. Promises, betrayals, who you once were, and who you refuse to become. And now, for the first time in a long time, I was ready to begin again, not as someone's father or client or burden, but simply as myself. A man walking out of the courthouse alone, but upright. The weeks after the hearing passed quietly, not with triumph or celebration, but with the kind of soft exhale that comes after surviving a long winter alone. There were no fireworks, no phone calls of reconciliation, no dramatic closure. Just silence, and in that silence, something unfamiliar but solid began to grow. I kept to my routines in the small apartment. The window view, though modest, changed with the weather in ways that comforted me. I started waking earlier, not from dread or habit, but because I wanted to hear the birds. The coffee I brewed myself tasted better than anything served in that silent suburban kitchen I had been locked into. I kept the lights on longer at night, reading until my eyes grew heavy. I filled the new space with old habits, newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, radio hums in the background, the scent of orange peel on the radiator. I had no one to impress, and it felt like oxygen. The sale of the house proceeded, but not without resistance. Garrett delayed, filed motions, tried to sabotage the negotiations, But ultimately he lacked the standing. I had protected my share with care and witnesses. Eventually he caved, and the sale was finalized. I didn't keep the full profit. I could have. I would have been justified. But I chose something else. Not forgiveness, not exactly, but release. I split the proceeds evenly. I wanted no debts left on my soul, not even the silent kind that cling to the end of life. Garrett never thanked me, never wrote, never called again. I doubt he ever will. I mailed a letter to my grandchildren, not to scold or explain, just to tell them who I was. I wrote about their grandmother, about the birds she fed and the songs she hummed. I included a photograph of us dancing in the living room at Christmas, before they were born. I don't know if they received it. I don't know if Jody allowed it through. There was no reply, but I had sent it. That was enough. Sometimes you write the truth into the world not to change anyone, but to know it was said aloud, at least once. In time, I found a rhythm and solitude that no longer frightened me. I joined a small reading group at the library. Most of the others were younger than I expected. Retired nurses, a widower who used to be a mechanic, a young mother trying to finish her degree at night. They didn't know who I had been before, and I never offered it. We discussed books and memory and the strange way history repeats itself through people. I started writing again. Not just notes and lists, but pages. Pages filled with story, reflection, and confession. Walter encouraged me to publish, or at least to print a few copies for local donation. I might. But I'm in no rush. Some things deserve to take their time, like rebuilding a self you'd once allowed to be quietly dismantled. The apartment grew familiar, then comforting. I decorated it slowly, deliberately. A small shelf for the remaining books, a kettle that whistles, a quilt I found at a flea market that reminded me of Marlene's sewing patterns. I no longer needed to look backward with longing. I could glance, smile faintly, and turn the page. And as I sit now, pen in hand, sun slipping across the sill, I think often about the word weak. Garrett once said I was too weak to fight back. What he didn't understand was that weakness isn't silence. It isn't age or a cane or a slower step. Weakness is giving up your name, your memory, your truth, and I never gave mine up. I held it close, carried it when no one believed me, sharpened it until it became a blade, and with it, I cut myself free. I do not miss the noise of that house. I do not ache for the approval of those who chose to forget I was ever whole. I have known betrayal, but I have also known clarity. And in the quiet room where I write, in a life smaller but more honest, I have found a final kind of peace. Not the peace they promised me by removing my choices, but the kind I built back with shaking hands. I am still here. I remember everything, and I am free.